What's up, my airline family? I just wanted to bring a little something to you, something that I read this morning and started thinking about, and just wanted to share it. A little encouragement, maybe. I am outside, might be a little noisy, so forgive me. And I'm not great at this self-recording thing. Sometimes I seem depressed, and I promise I'm not. So I'll do my best to stay cheery, as my wife does so well. Anyway, so this verse I'm going to read to you, it's actually one verse. It's from the book of John, and it's chapter 18, verse 1, and I'm going to read. So it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples. So what's significant about that? Well, as I've shared with you before, I like to zero in on names and places when I'm reading and doing Bible study. And the name Kidron and just the fact that there was this ravine intrigued me. So I did some digging and I looked it up. The name Kidron actually means dark, turbid, obscure, making black or sad. So Jesus went over this to get to the garden. And what's going on here, let me back up a minute, is Jesus has just finished meeting with his disciples. They had the Last Supper in the upper room. He's explained to them what's going to happen to him, that he's gonna leave them. And then he journeys from this area, from the upper room, past the temple, and over this ravine, and over the Kidron, to the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane down there a little bit. So what's interesting about that, when you think about that definition of that dark obscurity, was, what Jesus went through, what he went over, that dark valley, with a ravine actually being described as a narrow gorge with steep sides, very dangerous. But just the fact that it was dark and turbid, just this background meaning to it that gives it a little bit more depth, I believe. And so actually, as I read that, also, the footnotes in my Bible talked about this being mentioned in several Old Testament references. And so I looked at those, and those were very interesting. But the one that I thought was the most interesting to me was King David actually traveled the same path when he was king. King David, of course, being one of Jesus' ancestors. And so when you look at that and you read back in I believe it was in 2 Samuel, in 2 Samuel 15:23 through 30, it describes this. And just to kind of go through a couple of parallels with you, I thought was intriguing. I think you might find interesting too. So when you look back at this verse, and you look at this current verse that I just read from John 18, both faced treachery and conspiracy. In David's situation, his son Absalom, he was running from him, he'd rebelled, and he was trying to take over David's kingship. He wanted to throw him out. So David had to flee Jerusalem, and he ended up here in the garden, the Mount of Olives. And of course, Jesus, he also faced treachery, but it was from the religious leaders at the time. Both crossed over the Kidron, as I mentioned. David was fleeing from his son Absalom, fleeing from danger, if you will. But if you think about it in Jesus' case, he was actually heading to danger. He knew this was a very dangerous thing that he was facing. And both wept after they crossed over. David wept for the loss of what he knew, his life, and that his own son was coming against him. And of course, Jesus, he wept to the point of even asking his Father, look, if this cup can pass from me, if there's some other way, God, please let it be, but I will follow your will. So just to kind of bring this all together and why I think it's relevant, we're all going through some dark times right now, certainly, with this disease running rampant, and we're all on lockdown. We're all facing this, what I would call a Kidron, if you will, this dark time. But many of us have also faced our own Kidrons. Many of us in our church, we have faced addiction, we faced abuse, we faced cancer, disease, financial problems, you name it. Somebody in our church has been touched by one of these things. And now certainly we're not even allowed to fellowship right now, due to the safety of us. But we have faced that Kidron. And I guess I'd like to encourage you in this way, in that it makes me think back to what I've learned from the book of Joshua. And that is, fear is a feeling, but courage is a choice. We can be swept over by our feelings, and they can control us and have us do some crazy things. I can speak from experience, trust me. I've done enough crazy things. But we have to choose courage in this instance in what we're going through right now. And we will go through dark times. We will have that Kidron in our life. We'll have many of them. If God allowed David, who was, as God described him, a man after his own heart, and Jesus, his very own son, to go through troubled times and dark times, certainly we're going to be faced with those as well. But we can take courage in knowing that we can choose courage. We can choose to be brave and to rely on God's plan, in his will, in his provision, because he's able. He can do anything. We can in our limited ability. We have to rely on God. And that's what I think we have to do right now. So I would just take courage in that, and know that in each of those situations, they were victorious. David, he retained his kingship. It was a long battle, but he endured, and he retained his kingship. And of course, Jesus, he rose from the dead. He defeated death, and ultimately saved all of us, being that sacrificial lamb for all of us. So we will get through this, and God's glory will shine through this. So let us be those little lights and let God's glory reign. So peace out, Airline. Love you guys.